Hello again, everyone. I'm Greg Duque, co-director of the Veterans Advanced Energy Project, and I'd like to welcome you to our second day of Veterans Advanced Energy Week, the big picture. Global Energy Center Director Randy Bell and my Veterans Advanced Energy Project co-director Dan Mitch set the scene for the week. And Atlanta Council President Fred Kempe and Senator Tammy Duckworth had a wide-ranging conversation about transitioning from traditional baseline energy to clean energy economy. And Senator Duckworth introduced her idea of a Marshall Plan for coal country, a way forward to responsibly transition from coal to advanced energy without leaving our coal-producing communities behind. Green Tech Media's Julia Piper conducted a terrific interview of Congressman Jason Crow, where Rep. Crow stressed that veterans were well suited for the advanced energy space given their experience of taking an idea or concept and translating it into action. Jason also discussed his GRID Act as part of the fiscal year 21 National Defense Authorization Act. It seeks to break down silos between Department of Energy and Department of Defense in assessing and fixing vulnerabilities. Our Veterans Advanced Energy Fellow, Heather Tackle, moderated a timely session focused on post-COVID energy employment and economic recovery. Environmental Entrepreneurs Executive Director Bob Keefe cited 500,000 clean energy jobs lost since COVID across the country and a Build Back Better, Faster concept for regaining our footing in the advanced energy industry through an investment in research and development. Karen Whalen, a military spouse for a serviceman who served 42 years, discussed U.S. energy employment outlook, workforce development, called for investments similar to Economic Recovery Act following the 2008 recession, and an $82 million recovery plan. Nat Kramer, CEO of Advanced Energy Economy, pushed for legislation supporting clean energy. This all set the conditions for our Financing the Clean Energy Future panel, where LanzaTech CEO Jennifer Holmgren reminded us that technology grows exponentially, so we need to have patience initially. For example, hydrogen is going to emerge and will do so on the back of solar and wind. Also, a big focus of that panel was ESG ratings as a way that good companies manage risk, become more profitable, and protect themselves from lawsuits down the line. We wrapped up the day with a networking event by the Clean Energy Leadership Institute and a screening of the film, The Burden. Today, we're going to focus on the big picture. Soon, we're going to kick off our first panel, Global Energy and Environmental Justice, Addressing the Past and Shaping the Future. I'm looking forward to moderating a 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern Time lessons from conflict zones, energy access in fragile developing countries. 4 to 5 p.m., the geopolitics of energy transition. 5 to 6, networking session hosted by Bunker Labs. 6 to 6:30, Veterans Advanced Energy Fellowship information session. And then we're going to finish up tonight with a film screening of Tidewater. A couple of reminders as you participate. Remember to rate your sessions on the application. And I'd ask you to share a photo from your service to tell us what you're doing now for participation in the virtual cafe. Now I'd like to introduce Liz Dalton, Executive Director of Clean Energy Leadership Institute, who will moderate our first session. Liz?
Perfect. Thank you, Greg, for the introduction. And I agree, this has been a fantastic event so far, and we certainly enjoyed the networking session last night. As Greg mentioned, my name is Liz Ramsay Dalton. I'm the Executive Director of the Clean Energy Leadership Institute, and we are a proud sponsor of this event. And I'm excited to be moderating this fantastic session today. I would like to introduce you to our esteemed colleagues, but before we get started, I want to do a couple of quick reminders. We are on the record for this event, and we are currently live streaming on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you to post about what you hear today on social media using the hashtags Vets and Energy and tagging us at AC Global Energy and Vets_Energy. If you would like to participate in the conversation, we encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A portal located at the bottom of your screen at any time during the event, and we'll look forward to incorporating those questions as we go along. Please note that you can only direct those questions to us via the app, and we look forward to having them in short order. So without further ado, I am pleased to welcome our panelists, Sherri Goodman, the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security at the U.S. Department of Defense, Terzah Tippin, Principal Consultant at ICS Trio Global Solutions and mentor for the Harvard Kennedy School's Arctic Initiative, and Carlton Waterhouse, Professor of Law and Director of the Environmental Justice Center at Howard University School of Law. To kick us off, I thought it might be helpful for us to set the stage with each of your backgrounds and how you came to work on energy and environmental justice issues. And let's start with Professor Waterhouse.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this wonderful event today. My background in environmental and energy work really arose out of my first job out of law school, which was working for the Environmental Protection Agency through most of the 1990s. And when I was doing that work, it gave me a great opportunity to engage across different aspects of environmental work, air pollution, water pollution, dealing with these issues of hazardous waste, pesticides, production. But I also had a wonderful opportunity during that time to work with bases under the base realignment and closure process that's going on, and the way that those facilities needed to be addressed in terms of being cleaned up and putting back into additional uses in the communities where they were located. So my environmental work from there actually led me to go and do a graduate degree, PhD in social ethics. And then from there, I started law teaching, and I've been working in the areas of teaching, researching, and writing around the environment during that entire period. Environmental justice has really been my focus since the time that I went to law school. And I saw a direct connection between the way people in societies found themselves positioned relative to their status and opportunities, and their exposure to pollution, access to green spaces, and participation and involvement in making decisions about the environments in which they live. So that's kind of my background in the area, and I look forward to our conversation.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor Waterhouse. Let's go with Ms. Poe next.
Thank you, Ms. Dalton. And thanks to the Atlantic Council and the Veterans Advanced Energy Project for having me here today and to discuss energy and environmental justice with all of you. So the area of my work is the intersection of energy, environment, and communities. And that focus began with my lived experience as an Indigenous person in my hometown of Utiavik in the U.S. Arctic. It's a village formerly known as Barrow. And this community has less than 5,000 people. Although that's quite large compared with most rural villages in the Arctic, it's still a much smaller community than most people have grown up in. And still today, in 2020, we derive 50% of our food supply from hunting, primarily bowhead whales. And my family's been doing business in the Arctic for over 14,000 years in an environment that would probably kill most people in 12 hours. Now, during my childhood, our subsistence hunting communities were rapidly transformed by intense extractive resource development in just one generation. I personally witnessed the environmental degradation, social upheaval, and land use conflicts that accompanied this, if you will, corporate colonization of my homeland by fossil fuel development. So it's somewhat ironic, after working in communications, environmental management, and for Indigenous and environmental NGOs, I ended up working for large multinational resource development companies like TransCanada and Royal Dutch Shell, advising on new country entries from Alaska to Colombia to Iraq. And I was fortunate to work both at a high level policy development in the human rights and Indigenous rights arena through the World Bank and UN, and at the, I think more importantly, at the community level. So the emergence of concepts of consultation and consent for Indigenous peoples were a welcome progression from development at any cost, which is what I experienced growing up. So we moved the dial forward a little bit in 2007 at a global level and with the inclusion of consent before development projects proceeded. This was a big leap ahead for human rights and specifically Indigenous rights. But it was still a missing piece for me and what I saw in projects around the world, which is the lack of inclusion of people most deeply impacted by development, not being in the room when the decisions are made. So after seeing many projects fail, from Shell's Arctic offshore to Pebble Mine in Alaska and many others that I could describe, I began to examine what a successful model of collaborative development might look like. And I did that through research, my research at Harvard. But I had to get industry to listen after I found some of the answers, or at least why they should care about communities and people. And part of that answer is really economic when we consider that 73% of the top 190 extractive resource development projects in the world are stopped or slowed due to non-technical risk, most of which is conflict with communities. And this is at a cost to companies of over $20 million a week. So that got people's attention and set me on this road, both academically and in my consulting work, to work with companies around the world to develop a collaborative development model in which the people most deeply impacted, and it's not only companies that I work with, but actually governments, because their policies, environmental policies specifically, have a deep impact on the people on the ground. And so whether you're talking about a policy or a project, if you do not include the people most deeply impacted by whatever it is you're proposing to do, you're likely not to succeed. And I think, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more in the hour, that's the beating heart of environmental justice for me. And I look forward to talking about more as we move on through the panel. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Ms. Poe. And now last but not least, Ms. Goodman.
Great. Thank you very much, Liz. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you. So how did I get here? Well, you know, like many of you veterans who are watching and participating now, I started out in hardcore national security, nuclear weapons strategy. I was the first female professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee in the 1980s when Senator Sam Nunn was chairman of the committee. And after Terzah, having left Harvard Kennedy School and Harvard Law School. And I, during that era, our military complex, both in the Department of Energy and Defense, went from producing nuclear weapons and nuclear materials to waste and cleanup. So I say my career went from weapons to waste. And then after practicing law for a while, I joined the Department of Defense in 1993 as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security, essentially the Chief Environment, Safety, Health, and Clean Energy Officer for the Department of Defense, a position I served in for 8 years. And during that time, Carlton, I probably worked with you while you were over at EPA. And in this period, we were closing military bases, has been mentioned. We had, our watchword really was stakeholder inclusion for many things. At the time in the 90s, if any of you remember, back then, the Department of Defense was being widely criticized for contamination from military activities, Superfund sites, hazardous waste, Clean Air and Clean Water Act violations. And in a span of 8 years, we turned the Department of Defense around from being seen as an environmental laggard to an environmental and clean energy leader. And we did that by creating communities around our military bases. We created over 100 what we call restoration advisory boards. They were focused on bringing in citizens from around the communities to understand contamination that had to be cleaned up, whether it was active bases or closing bases. We had a very dedicated program on our closing bases as well. And 25 years ago, I issued the first and only Department of Defense environmental justice strategy, which broadened our focus from just general stakeholder inclusion to focus on communities that had been adversely affected by pollution around military bases. And that was a very, very important element of what we did. And I think that also creates, and we'll talk more about it, the opportunities now as we're in the clean energy transition to ensure this is a clean and just energy transition.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ms. Goodman. I feel like given the audience, some folks may be new to the concepts around environmental and energy justice. So Professor Waterhouse, I might start with you to see if you wouldn't mind sharing just a basic definition or give just a brief overview of what environmental or energy justice means to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz. And I would start off by saying that I think it's important when we think about this idea of justice as we relate it to the areas of energy and the environment, that we really consider justice in multiple ways, right? So justice is the ability for people to be able to involved in the process of decisions that impact them, as Sherri has already talked about, and as Terzah has already reminded us, that often communities have decisions made for them and about them, but without them. And Sherri's work really stands out for the way that she, as she's already explained, was so involved in making sure that communities were able to be involved in decisions about these spaces and their cleanup. And I had the opportunity to see that in South Carolina myself, in the Charleston Neck area. But beyond that, justice also has to do with your, I guess, proximity in some ways to the harmful effects of energy and to the adverse effects of the environment. So when you find yourself part of a group that around the country or around your individual country, if we were to look at it globally, finds itself disproportionately exposed to the negative aspects of the society's energy production or of the society's waste production, that's an issue of justice in terms of the distribution of the goods of the society and the harms in the society. And so justice in energy and the environmental context has to do with your exposure to harmful, adverse things. It also has to do with your engagement and involvement in decision-making about these harmful things. But also justice is about the health consequences of these kinds of decisions and the likelihood that you will have cancer or lung problems or heart attacks, strokes, all of these negative consequences from your exposure to these adverse things that are in our environment also create an injustice. And we're seeing that multiplied with COVID-19 as people who are in fact already exposed to high levels of air pollution have a much greater vulnerability to the problems of COVID-19. So environmental and energy justice can be measured around health inequities, measured around inequities in power and decision-making, measured around inequities in terms of exposure. But it also can be measured in terms of the benefits, like who in the society has access to clean air, clean water, who in the society has access to green spaces and parks that are not contaminated and polluted, right? So your ability to benefit from the positive things in the society, your ability to have access to the wealth produced from energy products, your ability to have access to being in the management levels and opportunities in the consulting firms and the energy companies and the companies that are producing the energy and producing the products that are causing these adverse harms when they take place. Your ability to share in the profits of these projects, as Terzah, I think, has alluded to, all that is related to justice. So for me, energy and environmental justice is very basically a question about whether certain members of societies in the United States and globally find themselves on the negative side of the environmental and energy equation rather than on the positive side. And if your group membership and your group identity, like race or your clan or your tribe or your ethnicity or the fact that you're indigenous, all relates to you being disproportionately situated at the bottom of all of these situations, that's a fundamental problem and a fundamental injustice that really calls for resolution as we move to a new energy society and economy We don't want to replicate these problems of the past. Ultimately, they produce an unsustainable formula, both in terms of political conflict, military conflicts that we see globally. And so if we think preventively in the way we go about planning, carrying out these activities, we'll have a much greater success rate, as Terzah has said, but even more so, we'll have a much better society, one that we can feel proud of, one that we can help our children to know that they can feel good about as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for sharing that perspective. I know that you've written extensively on the concepts of social dominance and group-based dominance. And as you just pointed out, these are US centric issues, but they're also global issues. And so I wanted to maybe transition to Ms. Poe for a second. Ms. Poe, based on your opening and just the fact that you've worked on projects from Greenland to Brazil, to the Arctic, to the Middle East, all over the world, I wonder, if you could share an example of where you've seen energy development and associated impacts and this concept of social dominance playing out. Are there any, threads or trends that you've picked up on in your work where you see that companies or policymakers get it right, or more importantly, where they're getting it wrong?
Right. Well, thanks, Liz. And I've got to say that both Sherri and Professor Waterhouse's comments really resonate. And I started my career out of my undergrad in contaminated site cleanup in the state of Alaska. And I worked with both federal and state entities all around this and got to travel all over Alaska, cleaning up contaminated sites, which taught me a lot. And often what I found since that very beginning point in my career was that both government policymakers, resource developers, environmental NGOs, often did what a Inupiat elder who was much smarter than I and taught me a lot, and a mentor, Senator Al Adams, called the UFO syndrome, where a government agency comes into a village or a community, and it could be rural, but this can happen in urban environments, as Professor Waterhouse has delineated. And they fly in the UFO, they get off, they say, okay, we've got the solution to this, and they build something or do something or create a policy and get on their UFO and fly away. And people in the community are looking around going, I'm sorry, did we ask for that? And what is that? And furthermore, how do we maintain it? What is it here for? And I use that example because it so resonated at a very young age for me, because it happened over and over again. And so as I moved into government roles and then eventually into resource development management roles around the world, I saw this occur over and over again. And I'll put it simply, it's not a problem of governments or resource developers. It's not singular to any industry. It is things, the common thread is it happens over and over again to people in communities. So I would ask the audience, and I'll ask again over and over throughout this, as you work in the world, think about the impact of whatever it is you're doing to the people in the region that you're working. For me, most recently, that's been Puerto Rico. When we think about rebuilding the electrical grid that was taken out by Hurricane Maria in September 2017. What we've learned in this process, and it is the largest public utility in the United States in Puerto Rico. So this is quite an undertaking. And through the almost 3 years since Hurricane Maria, what we've discovered is that what looks like a good energy solution actually has some unintended consequences. And that would be the second part, I would say, is really important to remember, is the unintended consequences. What do I mean by that? Briefly, in the case of Puerto Rico, it's considering solar and people rightly so wanting to do the right thing and going out and acquiring solar panels for their individual residences. Now that would, on the face of it, seem like a good thing. Have everybody move to a renewable energy solution that has lower emissions, is more reliable ultimately, depending on the transmission. However, what we discovered, the unintended consequence was, and it goes to social justice, environmental justice, is that it was people who could afford to put solar panels on their roofs who were benefiting from the savings of doing that, and at the cost of the broader grid that was serving the other 3 million people who could not afford, the people in lower classes, lower economic classes who could not afford to install solar panels. So this was a light bulb going off. It's called net metering. I'm sure there are energy people in the audience who understand the buyback in net metering. And my only point of that specific example is, again, this unintended consequences. We need to think through our policies, our projects, and our solutions in collaboration with the people that are going to be deeply impacted by them. Not in isolation in our offices in DC or Harvard or wherever we're all sitting. It ties back to the knowledge of the people in the region most deeply impacted.
Got it. Thank you, Ms. Poe, for that. And I want to, maybe Ms. Goodwin for a second. You're credited with coining the phrase threat multiplier when you're referring to the intersection or the nexus of climate change and national security. And I wonder how, through the work that you've done at DoD and elsewhere, how you see environmental justice and this community engagement or lack of engagement really being the next multiplier effect.
Oh, absolutely, Liz. Yes, so we coined the phrase, I coined the phrase threat multiplier to characterize climate, the national security impacts of climate change, a phrase that has stuck, so to speak, and had some staying power in describing the security impacts, which we now see daily, regularly with hurricanes, extreme weather events, drought, flood, sea level rise, affecting us from Alaska, which has changed mightily, of course, just in our lifetimes. And I've been going to Alaska for 30 plus years, to, all to the Gulf, to many parts of the globe, from Bangladesh to the drought-stricken Middle East and elsewhere. So, but if threat multiplier characterized the climate change as a national security threat, and also now we can include really COVID in there as well, an additional kind of collision of climate and COVID. But I want to give you a new phrase, because listening very closely to Carlton and Terzah and my past experience as well, with the need for the engagement at the local level that isn't, as Terzah just said, the UFO, you come in. I mean, I'll tell you, Carlton, you mentioned Charleston, which was a base closure back in 1993, one of the early base closures. And I recall going with Secretary Perry and Senator Hollings and a big delegation down to Charleston, South Carolina, to a very important shipyard community, provided a lot of jobs in that area. And one of the important things, two important things, I think, for the audience to understand here, we went to see not just the shipyard, but we went, at Secretary Bill Perry's insistence, we went to a BMW plant very close to the shipyard to see what new jobs, alternative futures could look like for the types of employees that had been at the shipyard, and to highlight in particular the apprentice opportunities available and the advanced technology training available for this plant that had recently opened in South Carolina. The other thing that was very important is we engaged with the community, and we didn't just, while maybe Bill Perry, made that one visit, we then had quarterly meetings where we met with the community, and we took stock of what actions we had committed to do and how we were doing, and we monitored and measured it. And so I would call this, we had what I would call, and what you all will need, is persistent engagement. Persistent engagement. As Terzah said, it can't just be a fly-in, by, I created this nice community advisory board, by, see you later. No. You have to be engaged on a regular basis, listening to the community. And then when you're in your job, whether it's, in the private sector or public sector, you have to hold yourself to account as well. And that's, I think, where the military leadership and training that many of you've had becomes so important, and actually translates very well, because you're mission oriented, whether you're working in public or private sector, as your next opportunity to engage on the community needs. And then I'd also say very important is understanding the health impacts. You know, we took a lot of time in the 90s to understand the health impacts of the contaminants we understood at the time, perchlorinated solvents, and many others. We have a whole new category of contaminants now called PFAS and PFOA that have polluted water, not only around military bases, but many other communities, industrial chemicals. And those need to be declared a hazardous substance under the Safe Water Drinking Act. That will actually help us. If you're at a military base, that would help get your investment be able to do the things that you need to do to develop the technology. Also, it drives technology solutions. So one of the other things I learned is that smart regulation based on a good health standard can actually help you drive a good technology solution.
Thank you, Ms. Goodman. And I want to remind the audience, we welcome your questions. So if you want to start typing those in, we'll get to them as soon as we possibly can. But I really appreciated you pointing out the intersectionality of our work. It's becoming increasingly more apparent that we're at a time of dueling crises. Between climate change, COVID-19, they're compounding upon each other. And from an economic and health perspective, as you mentioned, many communities, and I think particularly communities of color, have been hit hardest by the impacts of fossil fuel development, which is some of the stuff that we're talking about in the transition today. At the same time, we have the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and many, many more Black Americans in this country, reigniting a conversation about the inherent inequities and systemic and institutional racism in this country. So for the audience today, as we're thinking about environmental justice and economic justice and energy justice, I wonder how you all see that fitting into the broader conversation of racial justice in this particular moment. And what do you think groups should be doing to have conversations across different divides, be it political, be it race, be it, whatever, that we can further alleviate this burden? And sorry, that's a question for all of you.
Well, I'll go back to where I just finished. I think it's really important, the health impacts that disparately affect communities of color and low-income communities who are more likely to be exposed to air and water pollution. It's in our interest to have rigorous health standards and enforcement. We were in the Department of Defense, we could not have become an environmental and clean energy leader in the 90s had it not been accompanied by the very rigorous enforcement by federal and state environmental and health agencies at that time. Now, we often partnered with them. We called it partnering. If we could find a compliance solution where we didn't have to be in full up litigation, that was much better. And we always looked to do that first. But it's that holding us, it held us to a rigorous account in the way that Terzah in some ways is talking about how companies need to hold themselves to a higher account and then they can make smarter decisions. In the same way, our military and other federal agencies, you hold yourself to a higher standard and it's enforced by our environmental and our health regulators, and it leads to smarter health and decisions. PFAS is one area where I think it's going to be very important, but there's an other range of contaminants and health and disparate health effects. COVID, we're seeing now how it strikes disproportionately at low-income communities. So we need to do a much better job in that persistent engagement.
I'd also add to the excellent comments that Sherri's just provided. A couple of things. One is that we need to look at the historic relationship between where you live and what your race, ethnicity, or indigenous background are. In America, we don't have just a society where people's economic choices were free to be made irrespective of their group identity. And so since your economic and political realities were shaped by your group membership and group identity, our map, more or less, where people live was drawn under these systems of more or less open racial discrimination against African Americans and indigenous people and Latinx community members and Asian Americans. That's America's history. And the fact that we might decide today that that's less significant in making those decisions, it hasn't gone away, but the fact that it's less significant in making those decisions doesn't actually redraw the map. The map stayed the map. So if people were segregated and racially exclusive suburbs were created in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, they didn't stop being racially segregated. And the people who were forced to live in inner cities didn't all of a sudden move to those racially segregated suburbs, right? So when we look at people in America today and where you live, your racial identity is the best predictor of where you're going to live. If you're white, you're going to live in a neighborhood that is mostly all white. If you're African American, you're going to live in a neighborhood that's mostly African American. And that's not just a matter of individual economic choices. That's the history of the way our map was drawn. The history exists in terms of indigenous people and where they're located and what their options are and where they can go. And then you find this globally. You go to other countries and they all have their own group-based identities, right? Whether it's based on being Shia or being Sunni, or whether it's based on being Protestant or Catholic, or whether it's based on being Tutsi or Hutu, right? Your group identity largely impacts your experience within the society. So because of that reality in America and globally, it means that you always have to ask when you're making these decisions and look, who's in the room, right? Who's in the room? If I'm making decisions about members of a community or about communities, how well represented is that community in the conversation? If you don't have those people in the room, the best you can do is be a UFO, right? The best you can do is fly in for them. You have to work with them. A wise law professor wrote in an article some years ago about faces at the bottom of the well. And as Missouri said, that we have to begin by looking at the people who are most harmed, who are most marginalized. If we craft solutions that will work for the most marginalized, everybody else is going to be fine, right? So we have to begin making sure that the energy future we're creating and the environmental decisions we're making are going to attend to those who are most vulnerable and least resilient, right? Vulnerability relates to your ability to address and handle the stressors that life will deliver to you. And if you already have illness, if you already have economic deprivation, if you already have high levels of exposure to pollutants, that means you're in a higher category for vulnerability, right? And so we have to be attentive to the vulnerability and the differences in vulnerability of people in the country, right? Even as COVID has highlighted for us, everybody doesn't have the same level of vulnerability. But also there's a such thing as resilience. Sometimes people who have similar vulnerabilities don't necessarily have the same level of resilience. Resilience can be based on other resources and other opportunities and other institutional supports that you have available. So we have to be mindful in this work that we are attending to the needs of the people who are most vulnerable and the least resilient, and that we have everybody represented in the decision-making process and well represented. I don't mean you have one member from the community, right, who shows up or who's able to be part of your decision-making process. As Terzah has talked about, you create consensus with the community in establishing what the projects are going to be. That makes them more sustainable politically, socially, environmentally, and it's the best opportunities for us. The last thing I'll mention is also economic reality. As Sherri has mentioned, when they were looking at the closure of the base and the economic impacts of the community, they had to envision how are we going to create new opportunities for these people to work economically. And we have to do the same thing as we're looking at transitioning to a new energy future. What economic opportunities are we creating for people who are being displaced in terms of their employment opportunities, or maybe people who had already been displaced by the extractive industries or the energy industries when they came and located there, right? What new opportunities are we creating for people, and how does their racial background relate to their ability to access these opportunities? Have they had comparable levels of education? Have they had comparable opportunities for apprenticeships? Have they had comparable opportunities for mentorship? Do they actually experience the same access ramp to these opportunities that other community members do? If they don't, how do we lower, right, the obstacles and the difficulties they have to overcome in order to get onto an on-ramp for this new energy future we're creating?
I'm really happy that you took that direction in the conversation. I think it is no secret that the energy industry is woefully underrepresenting Black, Latinx, Indigenous people. And I think the same would be true on a global trend as well. And I think for a lot of clean energy employers who are looking to attract this new talent, I think as Bob mentioned, yes, COVID has put yesterday a dent obviously in the workforce, but this is a growing opportunity for this country and the workforce of our country. What do employers who are looking to attract this talent and this diverse talent to make more inclusive decision making, make sure that communities are represented in the industry, not just in consultation with, what advice do any of you have for those employers who are having to think about some of that, I would say, either systemic oppression or lack of opportunity that folks have faced to date?
If I could, I'll take that one. Because I'm so glad you asked that, Liz, and it builds beautifully on what Sherri and Professor Waterhouse were, the concepts they were just talking about. This whole idea that we have to understand the context of the areas that we want to do business in is fundamental, and context has been described in detail already in our panel. Who lives there? Who's in the room? What are the structures, governance structures around the areas we want to do business? What is the economic environment? What's the political environment? These are all pieces of the pie when you do what I used to do in industry, which is an assessment of a region, new country entry, if you will. You assess all of those factors and you assess them from a risk standard for the company, which I think gets me to an answer to your question. What I discovered over time is that our projects in industry, and it will be true for the clean energy industry also, is that we had more sustainable and longer lived projects if we built local capacity. So this is a local capacity building efforts. I'm going to boil all the great ideas we just heard down to that and say, if we look in the communities, in the neighborhoods, whether it's urban or whether it's where I came from, villages, and we build capacity at the local level, you will have multi-generational legacies of development. You will have people who are part of the solution. They're aligned with good outcomes because they're actually part of the project. You're not, again, UFOing in a workforce from some other place to do the work that needs to be done in your neighborhood or your community or your city. You're actually using the workforce there. Now, why would industry ever consider doing this? And I tend to like to make an economic argument because I would love to believe we do it out of the goodness of our hearts, but usually it's enlightened self-interest that drives us here. And why would industry consider doing local capacity building? Well, I explained this one time when I flew into a village called Kotzebue on the Chukchi Sea on the far western edge of the U.S. Arctic. I said to the people there, I was there to help figure out ways that we could bolster the education system. And so our project was a 50-year project at that time in the Arctic for an oil company. And I said in front of the community members gathered, I said, I'm not here to help educate kids. I'm here to ensure that we have a locally based workforce so we don't have to spend the money to fly people in from Louisiana and Texas and other places in the world. So in 5 years, I'll be back. And I want to see progress. And literally the community members said in the 40 years of oil development that had been occurring in that region or around them, they had never heard somebody from industry be honest, which is this is in the best interest of industry, of energy producers, is to work at a local level so their projects have alignment from stakeholders. Because remember those statistics I said at the opening remarks. 3/4 of the projects around the world, existing energy projects, are stopped or slowed due to conflict with communities. Now there's not a CEO of an energy company in the room, whether it's renewable or non-renewable who's going to argue with that statistic. It's an is. So your biggest impediment to success is not how you're going to build the wind farm or the solar panels or even bring LNG in. It's going to be conflict with communities. So you better solve that first. And how do you do that? By aligning the community's interests with your interests. This is interest-based bargaining 101, basically. So it's the capacity building at a local level, I'd say.
I add something to that. Excellent comment. And that is that, just to build on that, if we were to get out of the US and we were to go to Nigeria, for example, right? Go to Nigeria and you could find that oil companies have been there for some time. And in the time they've been there, there's a place in the Niger Delta region where most of the oil is produced called PortHarcourt. Now, anyone who's followed international news around energy, or really who's paid close attention to Nigeria, would know that this has been an area of great conflict for decades. Why? Because the oil company did just the opposite of what Terzah has said, right? They did not invest in that local community. They didn't invest in building their capabilities, in building their capacity, in helping them to develop as human beings and as community members. Instead, they lost their traditional ways of farming, their traditional ways of fishing. They were subjected to oil spills and gas flares in their communities, and they were not available or not considered eligible for any of the work opportunities in any meaningful way, because all of the persons working there were flown in from parts of Europe and other parts of the world. And so it's the exact opposite model. And what has it produced? Political instability for the country, kidnappings for the members of the oil company, as well as armed bands in PortHarcourt, because these young people who took up arms found that they didn't have other options or opportunities to be able to take care of themselves, right? And so that's a, kind of a story, right? A negative example for us to learn from how you can do this wrong, right? And produce a lot of unnecessary conflict, risk for your employees, hardships for your employees, and threats to your economic benefit, right? Ultimately, they were sued in their home country and lost because of their oil spills. So if they would have thought of how can we build the capabilities of the people who live in this region? How can we transform this into a place where we have the optimal employees we can bring? How can we invest in our educational system? How can we help them thrive to reach their goals as a community and not just our goals, right? How can we see these people as an end rather than just a means to our end? If you begin with that approach to the new energy future, we'll avoid a lot of the problems from our old energy past, which has been a lot of negative examples that we should learn from.
I think it's great. We're talking a lot about the role of corporates in this when they're doing project development. I'm wondering, maybe transitioning on that last point about education and at a community level, what action would you or any of the panelists like to see from a policy perspective, either federal, state, tribal, local? If the idea of community resilience and impact being local, do you start there? Or is there broader policy on environmental and energy justice that you think needs to be enabled to make the change that we're hoping to see with the clean energy future?
Well, there's a lot of important policy that can be had around environmental and racial justice that aligns with our clean energy transition. So as we look now to sort of update the environmental justice initiatives from 25 years ago, the first thing, and we've been talking about it, is the inclusiveness, a focus on inclusion of a broad range of people, sort of what I've called persistent engagement, and also from a human resources standpoint. And I'd say to all of you who have been leaders already in the military and now are looking for opportunities beyond that, your leadership experience already, I think, is very fundamental, because you've seen what it's like to come up through a pipeline. And many companies and organizations now have good standards at the entry level for diversity and inclusion. Where the challenge comes, and this is in traditional or clean energy or other industries, is often in the advancement of those same people who might have entered in equal numbers, men, women, different communities of color and ethnicity are not advanced at the same rate. And there are some, and the number of reasons have been mentioned here today, which is kind of what's your starting point, what's your ability to sort of fit into the traditional culture. We have to be hyper aware of that. Having been often the only woman in the room for many years of my career, I was very aware of that. But I learned how to fit in, but I think there's more than we can do now. You don't just have to fit into an existing culture. I think that we're now at a point where we should be changing. So that's second. The second point is we have to target our resources to the front line and fence line communities. That's been talked about here today. We really need to make special investment, particularly when we're doing new energy projects and citing to understand what's the impact on our frontline and fence line community, locally based opportunities for them. And we have to then prioritize environmental and racial justice in these energy activities, whether it's new batteries, new microgrids, wind and solar. That's going to be very important. And so that's an opportunity, I think, that many of you in the military, you start with good training on it, and you can extend that even further. And then the fourth point is, of course, health and a public health emergency, which we're in right now, but understanding how the health risks disproportionately affect those of communities of color and lower income communities.
So I'd like to build on what Sherri just said, and I think incredibly important that we're touching on this. What can government do? That's what we're being asked. Boil it down to that. And I think the rubber meets the road in government contracting and lease stipulations. So if we're moving to contract, if the government, which is a massive contractor, whole economies are dependent on U.S. federal government contracting. The Alaska Native corporations that in Alaska that I was born out of, Alaska Native Settlement Act, Native Claims Settlement Act. A big part of what we do is federal government contracting around the world, which has lifted me and many of my contemporaries as Alaska Natives into the bit broader world. I would not be here if it weren't for government contracting. And so I tend to think of it very nuts and bolts. We need to include requirements for local capacity building whenever government contracts are let. And this could be applicable not just at a federal level, but obviously at a state level and at a municipal level or county level, whatever you're calling your local government. But I think this government contracting is the thing that we could really, people in this audience, I think, would identify with. The military and former military people are experts at procurement, generally, in some form or another. And although it's not sexy, it's really, that's where I see where we embed, besides, policy, we get the policy right, but we embed the actual action in federal government contracting especially. And that's lease stipulations. In the oil world, we could transfer that to new clean energy development. But what I told communities is get your thoughts in on what the lease stipulations should be on this next oil and gas lease sale. Because if you've got enough support, it's going to be in there. And you can ask for a percentage of local hire. You can ask for capacity building in lease stipulations. So government contracting, I think, a lot of focus on that. And if people in the room here, and I know there's some of them, I can tell from all the questions I'm seeing in front of me, that they can, I'm jumping ahead to call to action, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, and I think thank you for pointing out the questions that are coming in. This is a little bit pivot back, but I think tying it into the local procurement requirements and engagement requirements, it's relevant. From the audience, we have a question that says, it sounds like trying to develop the local culture would result in the minimum unintended consequences. If so, do corporations, and I think that could probably relate to some of these procurement challenges as well, run into issues with that level of cultural invasiveness?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. participated, and I'm a member of the International Sustainable Development Research Society. And we had a conference, international conference, a few weeks ago, virtual. We were supposed to be in Hungary, but we had it virtually. And one of the big questions we were dealing with in one of the sessions was the ability of, well, I shouldn't say the ability, but it was this whole idea of coming into a community and telling them, this is the right way to do this, or this is what you ought to do. And, you know, I think that goes to this whole idea of cultural invasiveness, means that you don't find the ingredients within that particular community to empower those ingredients that help lead to the best decisions for them, rather than making determinations for what is best for them. And so that's why I think that if the federal government, if the government, state, federal, local, as well as corporations look to empower communities in the process, it means they're empowering them with education, they're empowering them with opportunities, they're helping to build their capabilities, then they will make good decisions for themselves. And that process of empowering them removes the whole idea of the cultural invasiveness, because now you are basically working collaboratively rather than determining their outcome. You are working collaboratively to reach a mutual outcome. And I want to connect that to Terzah's excellent point, which is that the federal government and governments aren't, and I think the past approach has been wrong, right? Governments have often taken a position that, oh, this is just something that has nothing to do with us. We need to let the corporation kind of have its opportunity, and we don't need to burden them with anything. That is a rejection of their responsibility to look out for those local communities. And if there is an unfair and unequal relationship, the idea that not doing anything is what fairness is just wrong. It's another way of furthering the inequities of the relationship that exists. So I think federal government has a responsibility to work on behalf of its citizens and residents, and that goes globally. So that means they have an affirmative responsibility to try to help empower those local communities to get the best opportunities for them. So I think putting requirements into leases, into contracts, into arrangements that are being made, having expectations of a certain level of community involvement, of a certain level of sharing of the benefits, right? All of this is part of the government's responsibility along with the corporations. I'll say one point just to emphasize that. In terms of the diversity and equity and inclusion conversation that had been mentioned, there was some discussion about whether or not at higher levels, diversity, equity, and inclusion is happening. And in many cases, as I think Sherri has mentioned, it doesn't happen at those higher levels. And one corporation I know that worked to change that was say to firms that came to them without any women in their team or without any people of color as part of their team, to say that if you want to continue to represent us, you're going to have people representing us who are representative of our society. And so until you produce for us the kinds of representatives who reflect our society in its totality, we're not really interested in working with you. And so those kinds of hard, right, courageous conversations need to happen if we're going to produce change in the dynamics.
Well, Professor Waterhouse, you've teed me up nicely to make a short plug for the Clean Energy Leadership Institute. And our entire organization and community is designed to help accelerate people's careers into those leadership positions in the clean energy field. And we are actively working with communities of color. We're actively recruiting and training a broad set of a new generation of leaders. So anybody out on this call who is interested in learning more, cleanenergyleaders.org, we want to be part of the solution to help bring more voices into this conversation. So thank you for that. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that we wrap up with just a few key takeaways. We've covered so much waterfront on these issues, and I just asked quickly for the panelists to each say, if you want participants to walk away with one thing or one piece of advice, what do you have for them?
I could jump in. I was just answering a question online. And first of all, I want to say thanks everybody for the great questions. I've been typing. I've been listening, but I've been typing. Really, really interactive audience, and that's so key to what we're doing. I'd say I probably already, you probably already know what I'm going to say. Don't be a UFO. Just, we're going to make T-shirts, and people will ask what that means, but it's just going to say, don't be a UFO. And you can sort of put a lot of what we've all been discussing in that. But more specifically, I think this last idea of the big idea, the BHAG that Professor Waterhouse just mentioned, which is systemic change, right? So we can nibble at the edges, and the edges are important, right? We can nibble, we can do this, we've talked about a number of different things that are important, but this systemic change, which comes from not creating dependencies out of certain populations, right? So what a learned helplessness is the light bulb went off about 15 years ago when I was out in a rural community. What I saw before me was some very capable people who had learned helplessness from industry, corporate colonization, so no inclusion, from governments that run without including them. We see this in Niger Delta, even worse there. It's a weak governance structure. That is the worst thing you could have going in, trying to do anything in a country, is a weak governance structure, because it can be corrupted. But this idea that we cannot create these dependencies either from companies or anything that we do when we go into a community. The idea is to co-create success. That is the sustainable plan. Creating dependencies means that the moment something doesn't go right, governments and companies can turn on you. And I would say the last thing to remember as you go out into the world is that the regulatory structures are there to protect all of us. And this idea of streamlining them, I have to mention this before we leave, is really, I'll say it, a code for dismantling regulations that we all need to protect every sector. And it goes back to Professor Waterhouse's original comments about if we float the sinking boats, all boats will be in better shape. I don't know if that's a good analogy, but that's what I'll leave with.
Perfect. I look forward to buying the No UFO t-shirt when it becomes available online. Ms. Goodman, let's turn to you for your final thoughts.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, it's been a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I think this has been a very enlightened and kind of different discussion than we have typically had either around clean energy or climate change in recent years. And I think that's very important. It really takes me back to a lot of the work we were doing 25 years ago in the Department of Defense and how relevant it was. And I have to say, we had over 100 community restoration advisory boards, but there was no one-size-fits-all solution. I mean, the way we ran a community advisory board, which, by the way, had a community co-chair co-equal to the military base commander co-chair. So, and the community leaders selected themselves, voted themselves on exactly who would represent the community. And what worked at Kelly Air Force Base in San Antonio was very different than what worked at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, for example, or elsewhere. Pick your base. And so the community needs were really important. And sometimes there was tension about whether communities were being adequately addressed either by the federal facilities or within the community itself. There could be different dynamics. And I think it's important to be attentive to that and then responsive to it. And that's where I think the good training and listening skills, both Liz, that you're talking about for your organization, but that I think are a natural part of the leadership training that you have in the military, but you have to be super attentive to. I want to foot stomp both persistent engagement, which you have to do, but also the opportunities inherent in the federal contracting. We've actually done better in many ways with diversity, equity, inclusion in the vast variety of federal contracting because of the requirements have created those opportunities that you may not see either in legacy fossil fuel or financial industries today. So I think that's, as we move in an era from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, this becomes all the more relevant. And so I think that you all will have great opportunities, I think, to be at the front line, really, of implementing new diversity, inclusion, and equity approaches to our clean energy and climate just future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Goodman and Professor Waterhouse.
Wonderful. First, I want to thank you all again for inviting me to be a part of this and just express my real joy in being here with such an impressive moderator and fellow panelists. I really have enjoyed this more than most panels that I do. You all are pretty much awesome in my opinion, so please keep up the good work. I also would just kind of as a takeaway say that the social aspect of dealing with environment and energy is really what we're highlighting. And in many ways, that's the part that was neglected historically. So kind of neglected the idea that there's a fundamental social aspect of the way we do energy development and the way we impact our environment. And people focused on the bugs and the bunnies, and people focused on the technical standards, and people focused on whether or not it was going to produce oil or there was going to be a coal, vein. But we have to consider centering the social component of the work. And if you become an expert on the social component of the work, you can be a transformative agent for the society, for the corporations, for the governments, and for these communities. So the takeaway is that social skills are not secondary skills, they're primary skills. And if you're getting into this aspect of work, consider the social skills that you've learned through your service and the social skills that you've learned through your past activities, and the way you can connect those social skills to communities in need and the needs of corporations and the needs of our government and the needs of our society for energy and for clean energy, and make those social skills the glue that makes this project or an approach to energy that avoids our problems in the past and helps us stick to a positive and new, bright energy future. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that powerful call to action. Transformative agents of change. All people listening, get ready for the future. I'm excited. I want to thank our panelists for spending time with the Atlantic Council today for this critical conversation. I want to thank all of you for tuning in and for your continued service, and just really appreciate the effort that goes into the Veterans Advanced Energy Week. I think it's already been a fantastic event and look forward to continuing it. If you want to rewatch today's session, or if you want to share it with a colleague, all of the replay can be found on the Atlantic Council's YouTube channel. It'll also be available in the app for those who have downloaded it. And our next session coming up in the conference program will be at 2 p.m. Eastern, a stellar panel discussion on lessons from conflict zones, energy access in developing and fragile states. I'm excited about that conversation, and we'll certainly tune in. But thank you all. Thank you to the participants, to the audience. We look forward to seeing you at the next session.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks to my panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you all.